miserable, living in a dinky apartment, doing nothing? You have gifts, man. And with any gift comes responsibility. You can't just walk away. If you don't give back to the universe what the universe gives you, then you really aren't worth shit. I hate to say it, but I hate even more to see you like you are. I didn't say anything. What could I say? I'm not saying you have to get some fucking job at Payless. Not at all. What I'm saying is that if you are ever going to succeed in anything, it has to become the most important thing in your life. What do you value, Derek? Where do you live? Can you answer that? Had he said these things a year or maybe even a day before, they would have hurt and upset me. But because the time was right, they helped. Later that night, hours after we hung up, and hours after I had taken a walk to Spirit Lake and sat quietly by the shore, I began to realize that I'd long since answered Craig's questions. I'd begun answering.
What initiates the shamanic process in the first place is typically an overwhelming trauma in which the psyche dissociates. This is the very wounding that activates the shaman within to start the journey of going in search of the lost parts of oneself. The psyche is by nature dissociable. This is either a defense mechanism that protects us, a potential pathology that splits us in two, becoming, in psychological terms, a dissociative disorder, or an incredible gift. The ability to consciously dissociate from a part of oneself can be a true superhero power. For to project a part outside of oneself and then to objectify it so as to relate to it as other than who we are is the very psychological mechanism that saves us from being swallowed by the trauma of it all. To consciously dissociate from a part of oneself is to disconnect, disentangle, and disidentify from this part. This allows us to potentially see it and develop a relationship with it, whereas if left unseen, it would keep us stuck in a neurotic or possibly even psychotic state. Typically highly empathic, shamans are very sensitive to the unconscious, both in themselves and in others. Existing in a liminal space, at the gateway between two different worlds, the shaman has very permeable boundaries between their conscious mind and the unconscious. It's as if within a shaman's psyche there is a bridge that allows the contents of the light and dark realms of consciousness to easily pass through, intermingle, and reciprocally co-inform each other. Through sympathetic resonance, shamans have an ability to feel into what is happening outside of themselves, be it in another person, a group, or the non-local field, inside of themselves. Finding the outside world reflected within them, they go within and become truly vulnerable, turning themselves inside out to creatively express what they found. Something within us that he called thanatos, the death instinct which demands our destruction. Freud realized that this internal force, what can be conceived of as a shadow of the will, actively resists and opposes the recovery of our wholeness in every way it possibly can. Jung refers to the same disintegrative factor as a morbid fragment of the personality, which inspires a will to be ill. The danger is that this sick part of the personality can devour and replace the normal functioning ego. Hidden within us is an unconscious part of us that actually wants us to remain sick. This morbid aspect of the psyche is firmly resolved to hold on to our state of illness and suffering, no matter what the cost. It should get our attention that Freud and Jung were both tracking the life-negating aspect of vertigo, each in their own way. Vertigo can simultaneously be the cause and the effect of trauma. Inherently overwhelming and unable to be integrated into the wholeness of the psyche, trauma splits the psyche. If one is sufficiently severed from one's intrinsic wholeness, this split-off part of the psyche can potentially develop a seeming autonomy. This can become, in psychology speak, an autonomous complex. What indigenous cultures call a demon that can go rogue and become an anti-life force, an agent of death, a part of us that wants to destroy us. This internalized element fosters unfeeling, destructive, even murderous acts within us, which are directed inward toward the self, as well as outward toward others, continually and chronically promoting psychic disintegration. This internalized agency is as close as we can imagine to evil incarnate, the dark side of God, existing within the personality. A word of clarification. The idea of the demon of sickness connotes the immaterial essence, the very spirit of sickness that informs disease on all levels: physical, emotional, mental, and spiritual. When a shaman takes on someone's sickness, the essential idea is that the shaman is taking on the spirit that is animating and is at the root of the sickness. The spirit of sickness has two main aspects: the personal and the archetypal transpersonal. In becoming intimate with the particular sickness that has afflicted the person, the shaman might acquire insight into the uniquely personal traumatic event and psychospiritual dynamic that initially opened the door for the sickness to invade the person's mind-body. In seeing the personal dimension of the sickness, the shaman can then place the sickness in its larger transpersonal context. This is to understand that this particular version of sickness is one of countless variations of the archetypal sickness of vertigo that afflicts our species. The wounded and the healed healer. In taking on the sickness of the person, the shaman subjectively experiences the malady from the inside, literally falling sick themselves, thereby becoming personally acquainted with the nature of the disease. This can be conceived of as being a creative illness as well as a wounding experience. Hence, the shaman is an iteration of the wounded healer archetype, Chiron in Greek mythology. The archetype of the wounded healer has to do with carrying the wound, reminiscence of carrying one's cross, which always necessitates a descent into the underworld to discover the healing encoded within the wound. In other words, finding the light that is hidden within the darkness. Only the wounded physician can heal. According to the myth of the wounded healer, it is their ability to be vulnerable. The Latin word vulnus means wound, and hence capable of being wounded and then bringing consciousness to their wound that bestows on the wounded healer or shaman the power to heal. The wounded healer has to suffer through the sickness in order to be able to cure it. This brings to mind the universal truth that only those who have truly suffered and thus know suffering can relieve others' suffering. Only those who bear sickness as an existential possibility within themselves can constellate the healing process in others. Because the wounded healer personally knows the experience of being wounded, they are able to bear others' experience without the compulsive need to fix them. Healers have healing abilities not in spite of their wounds, but because of them. In her book Shamanic Voices, anthropologist and Zen Buddhist Roshi Joan Halifax writes, "Balanced between worlds, the shaman teaches by powerful example that illness can be a passageway to a greater life. The healing image that the shaman projects is of disease as a manifestation of the transformative impulse in the human organism. In other words, by going through the experience of illness, the shaman epitomizes how illness itself can potentially be a spiritual vehicle leading to a life more in touch with who we actually are. The wound then becomes the portal through which the wounded healer or shaman accesses a deeper dimension of their being, the plenum, the pure, unmanifest potential that is the fundamental nature of reality. This numinous experience is the origin of their ability to heal others. The figure of the wounded healer has the precursor to the luminous divine physician. In Tibetan Buddhism, this figure is represented by the radiant medicine Buddha, also known as the healing Buddha, the blue Buddha. There are occasions when the shaman, by going through the process of taking on the demon of sickness, becomes even more in touch with their wholeness than before the ordeal. The alchemical image used to portray this is when a peacock eats poison, its plumage gets even brighter as they step into the role of healed healer. In ancient times, when the myth of the wound healer first emerged, the idea was that sickness was the result of a divine action that could only be cured by another divine action. This is the homeopathic concept, a divine sickness cast out by divine remedy, like cures, like. Because the sickness was vested with a royal dignity, it lent itself to a new attitude that saw it as also being laden with great healing power. Commenting on the figure of the divine physician, Jungian analyst Carl Alfred Meyer writes, "He was the sickness and the cure." These two conceptions were identical. Because he was the sickness, he himself was afflicted, and because he was the divine patient, he also knew the way to heal. Once the shaman interjects the sickness that is in the field, the sickness becomes an inside job. This is to say that the sickness perversely attempts to interfere with, enlist and usurp the shaman's inner resources in order to sustain and generate itself within the shaman's mind-body over time, as if the sickness wants to make the shaman its new host. Once taken within, the demon of sickness doesn't have an intrinsically independent, objective existence separate from the shaman, but rather it depends on the shaman's participation for its continued survival. Once interjected, the sickness is not just happening to the shaman, merely as its passive victim. It also becomes part of the shaman's internal landscape, such that they have an active hand in its generation. In essence, the shaman's process becomes that of discovering the role they are playing in nourishing the sickness within his or her own person, in order to find the strength and creative ability to stop feeding it. Paradoxically, the spirit enlivening the demon of sickness can serve to reveal to the budding shaman what in their unconscious is unknowingly complicit with the sickness. This enables the shaman to stop creating, to undream their sickness, by unwittingly helping the potential shaman deepen their realization of the true nature. The dark forces of Vedical can connect them with a higher form of light, expressing a more expanded consciousness that transcends the dualistic notion of light and darkness opposing each other. In this way, transforming the dark forces into secret allies, deputizes the shaman in training to be a true healer for others. How they relate to it, what meaning they place on it, how they bear the disease and the suffering that it brings, that causes the sickness to take the particular form it does, within them. Etymologically, to bear has to do with giving birth. The point is that how we bear, that is, how we carry the sickness, can potentially give birth to a new version of oneself. The shaman is thus adding their conscious awareness as best as they can to a process that happens to most of us unconsciously. The darkness encoded in the demon of sickness, according to Jung, is meant to penetrate to a man's vitals. We must be affected by it, otherwise its fuel, effect, can't reach us. Without a period of being taken over and possessed by an unconscious psychological complex such that it is lived out, we would not be able to integrate the complex into conscious ego functioning. We can only understand something, really grok it, meaning intuitively, empathically, understand it, if we experience it inwardly. We need to succumb to the sickness and let it penetrate us to our core, or we won't be sufficiently impacted by it within our own subjective experience. But at the same time, we must, to at least some degree, retain some independence from the experience. This can enable some measure of meta-awareness of the process while one is still in it, turning it into an object of knowledge. When we are touched by the demon of sickness, vertigo, it is imperative that we become aware of what has impacted us. To put this differently, it is crucial to learn what has affected us as well as, I might add, what within us has been affected. This is to turn something unconscious into conscious knowledge. The result of this gnosis is twofold. What has afflicted us has been transformed by adding consciousness to it, and we have thus been transformed. We've expanded our consciousness through our encounter. If we haven't developed a strong enough sense of self in order to be in relationship with these powerful archetypal energies, we can be taken over so completely by the demon that we become possessed by it, such that we would lose our ability to snap out of our state and self-reflect, and then losing ourselves, we could fall into psychosis. And so, there is the possibility of great danger when the shaman takes on the illness. They can identify with it and become absorbed in it, hence taken over by it, such that they not only cannot help anyone else, they then become just another person who needs help. This would tragically be a failed initiation. Knowing our limits. There are different ways of dealing with the demon of sickness, vertigo, depending on where we're at in our development. It's important to know our limits and not take on more than we can handle. or we can get in over our heads. If we take on more than we can chew or metabolize, which evokes the image of turning the demon of sickness into bite-sized bits that are easier to digest. Titrating. We will be unable to assimilate it into the wholeness of our being. This whole process is not linear, but more circular. A circumambulation, which is to say that at any given moment we might be relating to certain aspects of Wetico out there as being separate from us, while at the same time or the next moment recognizing other or the same parts as reflections of something within us. Typically, we go back and forth between these levels all the time as we become integrated with our nature. Though the ego is not who we actually are, it is important in matters such as these to not demonize our ego, our imagined sense of self, thinking that it is just an illusion that we need to kill, a common misconception in spiritual circles. Despite having a bad reputation, the ego has an important role in our evolution. If we haven't developed a strong enough ego, a healthy sense of self, we won't be able to stand strongly in our individuality so that we can distinguish ourselves from and be in relationship with these dark forces. In that case, we'll either dissociate when we encounter them, becoming dissociated ourselves, or will become possessed by them. In either case, we become disoriented, deranged, and out of touch with who we really are. It is helpful to remember that the divine light within us is never stronger than when it has to struggle against the invading darkness. If we succumb only in part to the darkness and are able to, by our own self-assertion, protect the little flame of light of our conscious awareness from being completely swallowed by the threatening darkness, then through this ordeal there is the possibility of gradually reasserting oneself so as to metabolize and alchemically transmute the sickness in a way that feeds our wholeness and connects us with a newfound inner agency. Shamanically inclined people have a capacity for ecstatic states. To be ecstatic is to be beyond stasis, i.e., to not be static or stuck, which involves stepping outside of our limited identity patterns and to be beside ourselves in a good way. In objectifying the demon of sickness, having it be beside, i.e., outside of ourselves, we are simultaneously disidentifying from it. Remember, identifying with it is the great danger, while at the same time creating ourselves distinct from and relative and in relationship to it. When we are unconsciously identified with something, we can't see it. It then becomes the lens through which we see everything, flavoring all of our perceptions, which renders us blind to it. We do not consciously choose to identify ourselves with such and such content, but rather we subjectively experience our identity with it as if it is the way things are. When we identify with a content of the unconscious, we weaken our consciousness, which is dangerous because when we are unconsciously identified with certain contents and perspective of the unconscious, we are possessed by them. In the conscious act of this identifying with something, we are letting go of our tight hold on it, changing our relationship to it. Once we disidentify with something, it is no longer equated with us, no longer at the center of our identity. It becomes only a part of us, no longer defining us. We then step into the position of defining it. In psychological language, this is the process of ego differentiation. In religious language, it is the process of detachment, the opposite of attachment, identification, possession.
Hearing your call, really connecting with your calling and finding your, being able to, the inner voice and the outer voice, really being able to creatively express yourself. Because the thing is, what I began to understand over decades was that, oh, wow, there's a part in me that you could call it the higher self or wisdom or something. And we all have that. And all of a sudden, I was in such deep trouble with overwhelming suffering that, every night I'd go to sleep and I'd have these dreams, these unbelievable dreams, night after night after night for a number of years. And I began to understand, I was cultivating, it was like having a relationship, an intimate relationship with the unconscious. And it was teaching me and it was showing me. And the idea is that's something that each one of us can do. And you see, and that's what Watiko, it's actually helping us to do that. It's forcing us to do that. And, just to say right now at the time in history we're at as a species, if we don't really, just, and it starts with the individual. It's not, you can, create new laws or legislation. That's important, but that doesn't really do it. The point is any one of us, when we actually, whether you call it see our shadow or wake up to the dream or understand the quantum nature or Buddha nature or see Watiko, it's all just different words for describing the thing, the same thing. That actually has a non-local effect on the field, makes it easier for all the rest of us because we're not separate. Do you see the thing about Watiko? It's actually helping us to see through the separate self, that we don't exist as an isolated, skin-encapsulated ego, but we're interdependent and interconnected with each other. And when you begin to realize that, the expression is compassion. And that's the Watiko dissolver par excellence.
It's the mantra of Compassion Buddha. We strongly believe that the power of this mantra is very strong to bless us with an ability to develop one's own compassionate qualities through which we will not only be able to heal oneself, but we will be able to heal others too. Mahai Satvaya Mahakarunikaya Taidyayan Tham Dara Dara Dhiren Dhiren Duru Duru Ittu Dhyam Salim Salim Prain Salim Prain Kusui me kusumari ine ine sitte anjolayam hapana